Welcome everyone to today's Business Leadership Series event brought to you by the U.S. Pan-Asian Chamber of Commerce Education Foundation in partnership with Wells Fargo. My name is Daryl Akana, Business Growth Consultant at Wells Fargo. I focus on strategic partnerships with regional organizations that support small businesses. Wells Fargo partnership with USPAACC is significant to us because Wells Fargo values the diversity and the traditions of the Asian community and is committed to helping Asian customers, communities, and nonprofits like the USPAACC achieve financial success and create long-term economic growth. To name a few ways we've partnered over the years, Wells Fargo sponsored the USPAACC's National Microgrant Program. We continue to co-sponsor the USPAACC's annual Business and Procurement Conference, and of course, the reason we're all here today, the Business Leadership Series, which was a recipient of the Wells Fargo Open for Business Fund grant. This Business Leadership Series is designed to provide expert insight and technical assistance to minority-owned businesses across the country. I'm excited to welcome today's moderator, Susan Allen, CEO of USPAACC. Susan has grown this organization across the country and expanded to 6 regions as the most established and largest nonprofit organization representing Pan-Asian Americans. Susan, as I turn it over to you, I want to emphasize what a special privilege it is to have you as part of the series.
Thank you, Daryl, for opening today's Business Leadership webinar. We appreciate the friendship, partnership, and support that Wells Fargo has accorded to USPAACC for nearly 20 years, including today having you representing our Western Regional Chapter. 3 weeks ago, USPAACC came out of our 38th anniversary and annual conference called Celebration Business Plus Procurement Conference in Las Vegas. It was a full house with 600 Asian American businesses meeting major corporation and government procurement and contracting officers, executives, and managers. Today, we will present the status of the economy and how it impacts the Pan-Asian American businesses. Our presenter, Charlie Dougherty, is Director and Senior Economist with Wells Fargo's Corporate and Investment Bank. Based in New York, he analyzes the U.S. and regional economy, commercial, real estate, housing, and construction markets. Charlie writes commentary and economic reports, which are featured in national media publications like CBS, Bloomberg, and National Public Radio. Let's hear from Charlie.
Wow, thank you so much for that great introduction. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for inviting me on to discuss this very important topic. Now, recently, the Wells Fargo economics team published a report entitled Shining a Light on the Rising Economic Potential of the AAPI Small Business Community. So what I wanted to do here today was to walk through some of the most important findings from the report. Now, I think the best way to do this would be to start by outlining what the actual demographics of the AAPI community are. So as you can see on these 2 charts on this slide, there's been a really strong growth within the AAPI community. On the bottom left, that shows what's been happening over the past several decades. So let me just provide some numbers here for more context. So overall, the national population between 2010 and 2020 grew about 7.5% over that decade. Now look at the AAPI community. That community grew by about 38% between 2010 and 2020. So the AAPI community is growing at a faster rate compared to the national population. And it's expected to continue to take that similar trajectory. You can see that on the bottom right-hand chart. This projection has the AAPI population totaling 46 million by the year 2060. So currently, there's about 25 million AAPI individuals in the United States as of 2020. So this community is projected to grow at a very fast rate over the next few decades. And now this is important because population growth is very closely linked to economic growth. And as I mentioned before, you have the national total population growing at a relatively slower rate compared to other demographics, in particular the AAPI community. So this important growth segment is going to be even more important over the next few decades. So let's move on to the next slide here and show where the concentrations of the AAPI community are within the United States. And you can see AAPI individuals are in just about every state in the country, but they're more heavily concentrated on the West Coast and some of the states such as California, Hawaii, Alaska, Washington. Of course, there's been an increase in the share of population, right? If you recall what I just mentioned in the previous slide, those 25 million AAPI individuals represent 8% of the total national population. That's actually up from about 6% in 2010. And you can see a similar trend across the different states. So just about every state has seen an increase in their total share of the AAPI community. So just to put some numbers behind it, back in 2010 in Texas, for example, the AAPI community was about 4.5% of Texas's population. In 2020, that number now stands at 6.5%. So there's been strong growth just about everywhere in the AAPI community, but it seems to be centered around some of the faster growing states in the United States economy. So Texas has been one of the leaders in terms of overall national growth. And I think the AAPI community is a big driver behind that. Then if you go to the East Coast, right, if you look at New York, New Jersey, that state also has a high concentration of AAPI individuals. So the West Coast, it seems to have a larger population of AAPI individuals, but it's really everywhere where this population is growing. The AAPI population is spreading out around the country.
Some 20-some years ago or 30 years ago when USPAACC was formed, we seemed to have the crystal ball in our hands, and we picked exactly the same high population state that you mentioned for our regional chapters. Guess what? They were in California, all along the West Coast that you mentioned, California, Seattle, and Alaska. They were in New York. We have a regional chapter in New York, a regional chapter in California, one in Texas, one in Georgia, which is one of the fastest growing Asian American states, and in the Midwest in Illinois. Of course, Washington, D.C., which is our national office, serves as the national capital area regional chapter. So we're glad that we have that crystal ball without knowing about it, and we are in the right place at the right time now, consistent with the population growth and prediction. I thought I want to mention that.
That's fascinating. Yeah, you see it in the data, certainly. So that's not surprising to see. And you mentioned a few states there like Georgia and Illinois. And the AAPI community, I would say their influence is only growing in these different states. So the growth, I think, is the important thing to remember, and then the fact the growth is becoming more broad across the nation. It's not just the West Coast anymore. Virtually every state is seeing an increase in their share of total population from the AAPI community. So with that, I think we can move on to this next slide. And this shows the growth. It's not just the AAPI community, the number of individuals that's growing. It's the number of AAPI employer businesses, right? So this is the latest and greatest data that we have. And if you look at the count of businesses in the AAPI community, that too has grown at a rate that's faster than the national average. So you can see between 2017 and 2019, the number of employer-owned businesses within the AAPI community has grown about 4.5%. Compare that to the national average, which is just 0.5% over that same time period. So AAPI community is growing. The number of employer businesses in the Pan-Asian American community is also growing at a relatively robust rate. And if you look at the actual count here, the number of AAPI firms as of 2019 was almost 600,000. That represents almost 10% of total employer firms. So I'm saying employer firms because there is a distinction between employer businesses, right? If you have a number of employees, but there's also a large amount of non-employer firms as well. So think entrepreneurs, contractors, people who don't have any employees on the payroll. So that actual number looks kind of similar when you look at the share, but overall there's about 2.4 million Pan-Asian American non-employer firms, and that represents an 8.6% share of the total non-employer firms in the US as well. So again, both of these measures that we just discussed, so 10%, roughly speaking, of employer firms, 8.6% of non-employer firms, that's a little bit higher than the total share of the AAPI population as a whole. So I think it's fair to say that Pan-Asian American-owned businesses punch a little bit above their weight compared to the rest of the nation. So let's move on to this next slide, and this outlines, how the AAPI business ownership community breaks down. So, of course, the AAPI community is not a monolith. It is comprised of a number of subcategories, and this just shows how that breaks down. So you can see Chinese business ownership represents one of the largest shares. That's just over 28%. Asian Indian, that is also a large share at almost 30%. But then you go down the list and it's, Korean, Vietnamese, Japanese, Filipino. All of these are very important members of the business ownership community among AAPI businesses. So this is how it breaks down. And I thought it was very interesting to see exactly the numbers and the data of the different subcategories that make up the AAPI business ownership community. This slide breaks down where the industries are, where AAPI businesses are most prevalent. And this is important to remember this slide, because in a few moments here, in a few slides, I'm going to show the experience of AAPI business owners throughout the pandemic. And if you look at the data and the industry breakout, what you'll find that as a share of total industry, AAPI business ownership is most highly concentrated among several industries that were most impacted by COVID and the pandemic. So the highest share here is accommodation and food services. So that's bars, restaurants, hotels, casinos, all of those industries that were, again, highly impacted by the pandemic because they are mostly high contact services and really impacted by some of the shutdowns and resulting things that came out of the pandemic. The second one here is retail trade. Retail trade was, again, adversely impacted by COVID-19 and the knock-on effects thereof. And then, of course, healthcare and social assistance, the third largest. This is an industry that, for very understandable reasons, was impacted by the pandemic as well. Now, of course, the pandemic, of 2020, that was in 2020, and now we're 3 years on, and some of these industries are still in recovery mode. But one of the interesting things you see now is that if you look at the fastest growing industries, nationally speaking, of course, these are actually growing relatively quickly, especially in accommodation, food services, and healthcare. So, of course, that's not every industry, right? That's there's a long list of industries, and the AAPI community is involved in, I think it's safe to say, just about every industry in the United States. And if you go down the list here, you can see, wholesale trade, real estate, construction, transportation, and warehousing. So the AAPI business ownership community is rather far-reaching across the industry landscape of the United States economy. So let's just move on here and look at where AAPI firms are the most concentrated within the United States. So as we mentioned at the start of this presentation, the AAPI population is at its most dense in several Western states, but it's growing just about everywhere. And if you look at the individual markets or metropolitan areas, you can see exactly where AAPI business ownership is most focused. So you can see those red dots, that's the share of total businesses represented by the AAPI business ownership community. So you can see Hawaii and Honolulu, that is the highest share. And that makes sense because Hawaii accounts for about 70% of the AAPI community. So if you go across the board, though, it's really in every major metro area. But in particular, New York and Los Angeles have the highest counts of AAPI firms. San Francisco, San Jose, those markets are also high on the list. But I think the important takeaway here is that just about every metro area in the United States has a very important AAPI business community that is likely growing very fast. I think if you go to Houston or Atlanta or Minneapolis, what you'll find is that maybe the data doesn't show that it's a particularly large share, but the impact on the local community is very evident by the presence of these AAPI firms. So let's move on and give you the latest statistics on what's happening within the AAPI economy. So overall, nationally, what you've seen over the past few years is the unemployment rate has come down very significantly following the pandemic. Right now, nationally, the unemployment rate is about 3.7%, which is very low compared to historical averages. And the same is true for Asian Americans. So you can break out the unemployment rate into demographic groups. And what you'll find on the bottom left chart, that's the Asian unemployment rate. And two things I would point out about this chart is, one, that red line is below the blue line, the national average line, and it has been for much of the past few decades. So the unemployment rate has tended to run at a lower rate compared to the national average. And since the pandemic, that relationship has held up. So the good news here is that for Asian Americans, their unemployment rate was 2.9% in May, which again is a bit lower than where the national rate at 3.7% stood at the end of the month. On the bottom right, that's the labor force participation, a similar type of story. So the national rate has struggled to bounce back following the pandemic for a number of reasons, but still, compared to 2019, the labor force participation rate across the nation is still a bit lower than where it was. Not true for Asian Americans, however. So look at that red line. That shows the labor force participation rate for Asian Americans. And it's not only recovered, it's actually sitting at a relatively high place compared to where it was before the pandemic. So this is all telling you a number of things, right? So the AAPI community is growing, right? We covered that. It's one of the fastest growing demographic cohorts in the nation. The number of AAPI businesses is also growing very quickly. The Asian American unemployment rate is lower than the national average. And I think very importantly, the labor force participation rate is higher than the national average. So this means that the AAPI community is contributing very heavily to economic growth in the United States. Now let's look at what's the experience of AAPI businesses over the past few years. And this is a really interesting data set that was last updated at the end of 2021, but I think it tells an important story. One is that all small business owners have been impacted by the pandemic. In fact, small businesses were the most acutely impacted by the pandemic. And you can see the rebound in small business ownership formation over the course of the years following that initial onset of COVID. And that yellow, or maybe it's orange line, shows Asian American small business owners. And you can see the recovery has been somewhat sluggish compared to other cohorts. Now, if you'll recall at the onset of this presentation, I said, the AAPI business ownership community tends to be concentrated in several industries that were impacted most acutely by the pandemic. And I think that explains a lot of why the recovery has been a little slow. In addition to that, the AAPI business community is concentrated in some of the cities that were most impacted themselves by the pandemic. So New York City, Los Angeles, these areas were really hard hit by the pandemic itself. So it makes sense that the recovery has been a little bit sluggish. Now, that being said, at the end of 2021, you essentially did get back to break even in terms of small business formation. So I take that as a bit of good news.
Can you share with the audience the demographic origins of the Pan-Asian American or AANHPI community? ANHPI meaning Asian American, Native American, and Pacific Islander communities.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this slide can help visualize just how large and diverse the AAPI community is. As I mentioned, it's not a monolith. There's a large number of subcategories, and I think it goes even deeper than what this list that we're showing right here. But this just gives you an idea of all of the different subcategories that roll up into this, what we're referring to as the AAPI community. So you can go down the list: Asian, Indian, Taiwanese. There's a large and diverse array of different subcohorts here. And I think the one important takeaway here is that it's such a diverse group, it's hard to capture what's happening in the AAPI community with just the data that we've already been showing. And one sort of statistic I hear floated around all the time is, well, in the AAPI community, they have higher household incomes relative to the nation. And the data certainly show that, but it doesn't tell you the entire story, right? So you can see here the median household income is higher for some subgroups and a little bit lower for other subgroups. So it's really important to dig deep into the underlying details and examine, the different economic data and potential outcomes for any demographic. And I think this slide, which gives you an idea of the breadth and diversity of the AAPI community, does just that. So that being said, there are also a diverse number of industries and occupations that AAPI individuals tend to work in, right? So if you go down the list, and one thing that I think contributes to the overall average, higher than average, higher median household income is that AAPI individuals tend to work in industries that on average have higher paying salaries and income. So if you look at this chart, there's a lot of the AAPI community is concentrated within computer and mathematical engineering, architecture, legal, management. These are broad occupational categories, but you can see by those blue bars, that shows you the Asian share of that occupation. AAPI community, they tend to have a higher representation in these occupations. But again, that's just a handful of examples. You can go down the list here. I think it's fair to say that the AAPI community has a key impact on just about every single occupation in the United States economy. This is just where the highest shares tend to be and average out over time.
Thank you, Charlie. That is a lot of good information, particularly for folks who want to know more about the Pan-Asian American, Asian American, Native American, and Pacific Islander community. A growing group, great in business, want to work, adversely impacted by COVID-19, slow in recovery, but now coming back to near normal. And this is who we are. We love America. We want to make the American dream. That's what we want to do. And thank you, Charlie, for giving us all that information and our viewers all that information. Would you also tell the viewers about the occupation that the Pan-Asian American community mainly engage in large part?
Yeah, for one, I think that the AAPI community is involved in some way in just about every industry and occupation within the United States. But as you sort of alluded to there, that AAPI individuals tend to be, on average, most concentrated in several different occupations. So this chart outlines just where those occupations are. So the blue bars represent the Asian share of occupation. So the larger or the tallest blue bars means there's a higher relative share within that specific occupation. So you can see at the top of the list that computer and mathematical, architecture and engineering, legal are the top three. But there's a large number, a diverse number of different occupations where AAPI individuals tend to play a larger role. So you can go down the list. It's just about every industry, ranging from healthcare to arts and entertainment, to farming and fishing, to food prep and serving. So I think this shows just that, one, the AAPI community tends to be in occupations which have a higher than average wage. And I think that's what explains why, on average, the median household income for Asian Americans tends to come out on the higher end of things. But two, that just about every industry has a prevalence of AAPI individuals that is really critical to driving success in that particular industry or occupation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Charlie. Inflation is in everybody's mind, and the lack of a ready and skilled workforce and the heightened interest rate, these are affecting the quality of life of Americans. Where are we going with this? How do small businesses deal with these new challenges?
Yeah, inflation has had and continues to have a very substantial and adverse impact on every American, every business owner, every small business owner, including AAPI firms. And, I guess there's a bit of good news here in the fact that consumer price inflation does appear to be moderating. Right. At one point, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, was up over 9% on a year-to-year basis. Now it's below 5%. But it's still a hot pace of inflation, a hot pace of price increases. So if you look at what's been driving inflation, it's been a number of things: higher goods prices from fiscal stimulus and the pandemic, those prices seem to be easing. Energy costs have gone up, as a result of the Russian-Ukraine situation. Now that seems to be easing as well. But service sector prices are still elevated and look like they are coming down a little bit slower. So overall, the pace of inflation remains pretty hot. Now, this is impacting small businesses of all types, right? So if you look at surveys of small businesses, they've consistently reported over the past year and a half that inflation was their number one problem. So it's a big challenge for the small business community, and I think it's safe to say it's a very large problem for the AAPI business community as well. Now, it also explains why interest rates are significantly higher than where they were, call it 2 years ago. So because we've had really hot inflation pressure, the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates pretty aggressively over the past year or so. So in just the past 13 months, we've had about 500 basis points of increases in terms of the Fed funds target rate range. So this is meant to reduce inflation pressures. Now, inflation's coming down, but it's still well above the 2% target that the Fed would like it to be at. And that's why we think the Fed is actually going to raise rates by another 25 basis points over the course of the next month or so. And then if you kind of look at the course of the next year, we think the Fed is going to keep interest rates elevated relative to where they were in recent history. So you can see by this chart, we have the Fed, no longer raising interest rates, right? We think they have another 25 basis points left in their hiking cycle. But after that, we think they kind of, hold rates steady. And then, once the economy starts to weaken, once inflation does get closer to 2%, then the Federal Reserve will start reducing interest rates. But that probably doesn't happen until about Q2 of 2024. So interest rates are high. It's meant to contain inflation. Once price pressures do start to be reduced, once inflation is closer to 2%, then interest rates should start to come down.
Charlie, then for small businesses like many of our constituents, what are they to do in strategizing and planning for the short term and long term? Would their plan and strategy be different if they are struggling still compared to those who are on an upward trajectory?
Yeah, it's still a really challenging situation, right? We talked about inflation, but it's not just inflation. It's not just higher prices. It's a tight labor market, for example, right? So surveys are telling us that it's still a challenge to attract and retain labor. And of course, labor is critical to the small business community. On that same vein, input prices have also gone up. Supply chain challenges still persist. Things have gotten a little bit better, but it's still, it's still an obstacle to procure different material inputs that are critical for small business success. So there's still a lot of challenges, a lot of hurdles to clear moving forward. So I think it's important to be cognizant of those challenges and the fact that there's probably not an easy solution. But I think, if business owners pay good attention to what these, potential challenges could mean for their individual businesses, I think recognizing them and planning for them and knowing that there is unlikely to be an easy solution to labor shortages, reduced access to procuring materials. I think that will be an important first step.
As I said at the beginning of the webinar, our organization just finished our 38th anniversary or our annual national conference in Las Vegas. It's a 3-day conference. One of our most popular programs, Charlie, was the Chief Procurement Officers Forum, with 11 of them coming together and spoke about this very topic. How do small businesses who want to follow them and strategize and plan for their future according to the customers' needs and demands, as well as the potential customer needs and demand. And these are the three things that the CPOs talked about. And manage your inventory smartly. Some of them advocate for buying a lot now, so that you will not be in wanting, just like during COVID-19, you're short of inventory. Others are saying that we're going to just buy enough for the time being, so that when the prices come down, we're not stuck with inflated prices. And they ought to be able to take care of what to do with the cash on hand. How are you going to use your cash? Use it wisely so that you have it ready, just in case, for example, you have another SVP fallout. The bank in California, you will not be holding the bag standing on the sidewalk. And finally, how to manage your workforce. Some are advocating keeping your existing workforce because they are the people who know your business, who can perform well for you, who are loyal to you. Keep them, even if sometimes you have to bench them. But others saying that we're going to unload them so we do not carry that big burden. And that's what the 11 CPO talk about. And it is quite interesting, particularly for the smaller vendors, Charlie. When they want to open the door, one of the CPOs said, I'm going to get into my closet, meaning I'm going to find my existing vendors, people who have been standing in line to become my vendor. I'm going to look at them and develop them. And the good news that come out of our conference is that they are all interested in maintaining and making sure that they grow the diverse suppliers. They're interested in meeting more suppliers who are capable, who are interested in knowing about the industry and becoming a partner to them. So I want to share with you and the audience that little tidbit. Well, Charlie, before we close, what are some of your final thoughts and what wisdoms that you want to tell our small business owners?
Yeah, thanks. So just to kind of recap everything, the AAPI community is growing. It's spreading out in different places around the country. It's not just the West Coast. It's fast-growing areas where the AAPI community is a driver of growth now, like Texas and Georgia and other places around the nation. The AAPI small business community is also growing, and it's growing a good bit faster than nationally. And so, it's really important to remember that, over the next few years, there might be some ongoing challenges with a more difficult macroeconomic backdrop, with inflation, higher interest rates, but long term, because the AAPI community and small business community in particular is growing at a fast rate, the United States economy over the long term is going to be depending on these individuals and small businesses as a source of growth. So I think that, moving forward is something, really important to keep in mind, right? Remember that those population and business growth statistics I shared with you a few moments ago. So looking ahead, over the next few decades, where the growth is, that's going to be extremely important to driving overall national growth in the United States. And the AAPI community is well poised to be a big part of that.
Well, thank you, Charlie, for this very informative and insightful dialogue. We only get folks like you once in a while, and you bring wisdom, experience, and great lessons to learn from your presentation. Hope that you'll come back again and tell us more. Through your presentation, a lot of our audience will have a better understanding of our community, diverse, robust, anxious to succeed, anxious to go to work and be part of the building America and to remain the world leaders in economic development and growth. Thank you, Charlie. I am now going to hand this mic back to Daryl. Daryl?
A big thank you today to both Mrs. Allen and Charles Doherty for your presentation. And of course, to our viewers, thanks for tuning in. We hope you took away some great insights about what our economy looks like and how to navigate the economy from your unique perspective as a business owner. Wells Fargo has a wealth of additional tools and resources, which can be found at wellsfargo.com/biz, B-I-Z. Check back at USPAACC.com/events for more Business Leadership Series events coming soon. We hope to see you again and have a wonderful day.